Welcome back. In the previous step, we configured a service in the backend. In this step, what we want to do is we would want to use this service from the backend and call it in our login page. Our login page is using hard-coded authentication. Login, actually, authentication, hard-coded authentication service. That's the one where we have hard-coded this authentication in right now, and we don't want to hard-code the authentication anymore. So what we'll do is we will change that. What I'll do is I'll copy this, right click, copy this file, and again paste it into the same folder. Click paste, and you'd see that now there are two hard-coded authentication services. So .1.ts, let's change that. I'll not call this .1.ts. What I'll do is I'll call this basic authentication service.ts, and I'll also rename the name of this class to basic authentication service. So what we did is we copied the hard-coded authentication service, actually the service class service.ts, and renamed it to basic authentication.service.ts, and we renamed the class as well to basic authentication service.service. And now what we want to do in here is all the basic authentication logic we would want to put it in here. Right now this is the validation we are doing, and this is not good. What we'll do in here is we'll try and hit the HTTP service which we have created just now, the basic auth. I'll go to the data package. Let's pick up the welcome data service. We already have a little bit of stuff in here to invoke the hello world stuff. So I'll copy these two methods, Control C, and I'll put them down here. Let's maximize the screen so that we can focus on this. The first thing I'll do is, you can see that HTTP headers is giving a compilation error, control space. Let's import the HTTP headers in. You can see that the HTTP is not available here. The way we can bring it in is by making it available in the header, actually the constructor for dependency injection. So private HTTP client. So that's fixed. Let's see what other errors are there. The hello world bean is not there. Instead of hello world bean, I'll call this authentication bean. Authentication bean. Let's use the same name which we used here. We call it authentication bean. So let's use it as authentication bean in here as well. Let's create the authentication bean class at the bottom. So export class authentication bean, and I'll say constructor public message string, and let's create the empty constructor in. Oops, there's a typo here. It should be constructor. Cool. Now this class would compile. So let's see what happens. So now the only thing which needs some attention is I don't really have a dollar name. What we will do is the service name is little different, right? The service which we would want to call is basic auth. So let's copy it from here and paste it down here. So basic auth is the service name that we would want to use. One of the other things you can see in here is this is not really needed. This is name, and I can remove that out because we are not using name anymore. And I'll rename the method to say execute basic authentication service, or because it's already there in the class, I'll just call this execute authentication service. So what we are doing in here is we are just calling the basic authentication service. This is adding in the header and all that stuff, so it's fine. What we have done until now is we have created this method execute authentication service. This would be able to call the execute authentication service by passing in the specified HTTP headers. One of the things which we are also attempting to do is to replace this authenticate method with this execute authentication service method. So what I'll do is I would want to use the username and password which is entered in the screen. So let's add these parameters username and password. And now when I'm calling the basic authentication header, I would want to actually use this stuff in. So what I'll do is for now, what I will do is I'll just copy this logic and remove this method, because we would want to actually do a lot of stuff with this a little later. So I'll just put this logic directly in here, and I would want to actually not use the username password which is authenticated. So let's delete this. So now you have the authentication header which is being created in here, and let's not really return it back. So I'll use the authentication header and execute the service right from here. Let's take a quick review of what we have done until now. We have created a very similar method to our authenticate username password. In the earlier method, we have hard-coded authentication. Now what we have done is we have created the basic authorization string or the basic authentication string and set it as a header in the call to the basic auth. We will further enhance this in the next step.